Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. This program, this is an official announcement, this program is funded in part by the Michigan Humanities Council, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. There, that's the commercial. We thank the Michigan Humanities Council for their excellent and continuing support of programs that we put on the Piast Institute. Our guest today is someone I've known for a while and whose work I've admired for a long time. I promised it would be a very short introduction, and also I had oral surgery and I'm not going to talk for a long time. I asked John what did he want me to say about him. He said, he's a great guy. And he is a wonderful guy. But just let me note that John has had a long and distinguished career as a professor of American literature, a teacher of creative writing, and in his secret life, a writer, a poet, an essayist. He's published a number of works. He has 4 prior books. His works have always kind of amazed me. And I'm not the only one. Czesław Miłosz even said, this guy is astonishing. And so I think you're in for a treat today. I'm going to turn it over to John. He will kind of do his own introduction. And we'll tell you today his story and the story of his parents. That's been the subject of most of his writing, and it's a compelling and dramatic story. Painful one, but it's part of the American story and it's part of the Polish story. John?
Thank you. I want to run a video clip first. So it's a sort of, usually I do an introduction and it takes too long, and my wife always says, too much introduction. So I've got this video thing, it's like 2 minutes long. It's an introduction to me and an introduction to my folks. So we'll just play that and then I'll get these suitcases. Made from wooden boards by brothers we left behind. Came from Buchenwald and Katowice, and before that Lvov, our mother's true home. Came with our tongues in tatters, our teeth in our pockets, hugging only ourselves. When you read about history in the history books, it's all so clear. The history books, for instance, tell you that World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, that the war in Europe ended almost 6 years later on May 8th, 1945. My father, Jan Guzlowski, never went to school, never could read much beyond what he could read out of a prayer book. But he knew history. He had lived through history. He was a teenager working on his uncle's farm in Poland, captured by the Nazis in a roundup in 1940 and was taken to Germany. Like a lot of other Poles, he spent the next 5 years at hard labor in concentration and slave labor camps. He has his skin. He has a thinness to his eyes no bread will ever redeem. He has no belly, and his long muscles stand out in relief as if they had been flayed. There is always the empty sea in his belly, rising, falling, and seeking land. And next to him, there's always another starving man who says, "Help me, brother, I am dying here." The war was always with him, and with my mother, Teresa Guzlowski, too, a woman who spent 2 years in the slave labor camps in Germany, and before that had seen the women in her family raped and murdered by the Germans. My mother learned that sex is bad, men are worthless, it is always cold, and there is never enough to eat. She learned that the world is a broken place where no birds sing, and even angels cannot bear the sorrows God gives them. The trauma of what she had seen never left her. My parents knew that the war had always been with them, teaching them how to survive what would kill a person in the normal course of life. The war taught them that war had no beginning and no end. I'm going to read some poems about my parents, and I'll probably read for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then I'll take questions and I'll talk. I like talking to people, because I find that a lot of times people in the audiences have shared experiences with my parents. So I'll read for about 35 minutes or so, and then we can talk. My parents were taken as teenagers into Nazi Germany to work in the slave labor and camps there. My father spent 5 years in Buchenwald. When I tell people that Poles were taken to Germany as slave laborers, people are surprised. And what I tell them is that the Germans took about 15 million people, Poles, Romanians, Greeks, Italians, French. I mean, they just took 15 million people, people who they felt were subhuman and would only be good for the kind of work that a mule could do. And I always say, I'm one of those subhumans. I'd like to read 2 poems first about my parents before the war. I think personally, I too often focus on the war and don't talk enough about what happened before the war and what happened after the war. So I like to read two poems, one about my mom and one about my dad, what they were like before the war. Okay. My father before the war. My father thought he would always live according to the seasons and holy days. They came regularly like the ringing of bells from the church steeple in his village north of Poznań. He'd put on the blue suit his uncle gave him when he turned 16, and he would wash his hands and walk to church. A good boy. He always loved going there on Holy Saturday to have the food, the eggs and butter, the salt and bread blessed with holy water by the priest. My father loved going early to church on Easter Sunday, leaving the farm with his aunt and uncle before the sun was even a pink silence over the east, and coming to the church where little girls in their white dresses stood holding lilies while the boys seemed serious and awkward in the suits handed down by their brothers. And my father loved May Day, when he pledged his hands and his heart and his soul to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And he loved Pentecost, when he imagined the tongues burning like candle flames in a darkened church above the heads of the apostles. And he loved Christmas with its mysterious midnight mass that began in darkness and ended in light, and the feast of the Three Kings, and more. My father imagined this would always be the life he lived in his holy village north of Poznań. My mother before the war. My mother loved picking mushrooms in the spring, and even when she was little, she could tell the ones that were safe from the ones that weren't. She loved climbing the tall white birch trees in the summer when her chores in the garden and the kitchen were done. She loved to ride her pet pig, Caroline, in the woods too, or sit with her pet pig and watch the leaves fall in the autumn. My mother felt that Caroline was smarter than her brothers Vladu and Jan, but not as smart as Genya, her sister who was married. Her sister who was married and had a beautiful baby girl. My mother always loved to sing. There was a song about a chimney sweep that she would sing over and over. And when her father heard it, he sometimes laughed and said, "Tekla, you're going to grow up to marry a chimney sweep, and your cheeks will always be dusty from his dusty kisses." But my mother didn't care if he teased her so much. My mother loved that song, and another one about a deep well. She loved to sing about the young girl who stood by the well waiting for her lover, a young soldier, to come back from the wars far away. My mother never had a boyfriend, and her mom said she was too young to think about boys. But Tekla didn't care. She loved the song and imagined she was the girl waiting for the soldier to come back from the war. All of that ended when the war actually started. And I want to read a poem right now called "My Mother Was 19." And it's about the day that the German soldiers came to her village west of Lvov. My mother was 19. Soldiers from nowhere came to my mother's farm, killed her sister's baby with their heels, shot my grandmother too. One time they shot her in the neck, and then for kicks they shot her in the face lots of times. They saw my mother, they didn't care. They saw my mother, they didn't care she was a virgin dressed in a blue dress with tiny white flowers. They raped her so she couldn't stand up, couldn't lie down, couldn't talk. They broke her teeth when they shoved the dress in her mouth. If these guys had had a camera, they would have taken her picture and sent it to her. That's the kind of men they were. Here's what my mother said about all this. Let me tell you, God doesn't give you any favors. He doesn't say, now you've seen this bad thing, but tomorrow you'll see some good thing. And when you see it, you'll be smiling. That's bullshit. I use the word bullshit there because it was one of the first words my mother learned when she came to America. And for me, I feel it's a word that summarizes a lot of what she felt about life after her experiences when the Germans came and after her experiences in the slave labor camps in Germany. I'm going to read a poem called Cattle Train to Magdeburg. My mother was able to escape from her house and from the Germans, and she ran into a woods, a forest near her home. And she was able to hide there for a very short time with a lot of other people from the village. But what happened was that the Germans surrounded the woods that she was hiding in, and they went through the woods and they picked people out and put them on boxcars and sent the ones they felt could work. They sent them to Germany, and they sent them to Magdeburg, which was a clearing area. And from Magdeburg, they would then be sent to various camps throughout Germany. And so it's a poem called Cattle Train to Magdeburg. And I guess one of the points of the poem is that these memories of that cattle train never left my mother. Cattle Train to Magdeburg. My mother still remembers the long train to Magdeburg, the boxcars bleached gray by Baltic winters, the rivers and the cities she had never seen before and would never see again, the sacred Vistula, the smoke-haunted ruins of Warsaw, the river Warta, where horse flesh met steel and fell, the leather fists of pale German boys her own age, perhaps 17, perhaps 19, but different, convinced of their godhood by the cross they wore, different from the one she saw and knew in Poland. The long twilight journey to Magdeburg, 4 days that became 6 years, 6 years that became 60, and always a train of boxcars bleached Baltic gray. My mother never read my poems for a long time. My poems were written in English, and she could read English, but she wasn't comfortable reading English. And in 2002, I had a book of my poems published an earlier book published in Poland at the University of Silesia in Katowice. And I went to Poland, I did a book tour, and I came back with the book. And I went to my mother and I said, Mom, now you can read these poems that I've been writing about you and Dad. All of these years, 20-something years I've been writing these poems about them, and they had never read these poems. And my mother said, And I gave her the book, and she opened the poem to the first, she opened the book to the first poem, and that poem, the Cattle Train to Magdeburg poem, was in that collection also. And she read the poem, and she looked at me and she said, that's not the way it was. And I said, what do you mean? Dad told me that that's what happened. And my mother said, let me tell you how it was. And as a writer, in a situation like that, what do you do as a writer in a situation like that? You grab a legal pad and you start writing as quickly as you can, because here's your mother telling you what really happened. I wrote a poem called My Mother Reads My Poem, Cattle Train to Magdeburg. I'm going to read it right now. I'm looking, here it is. My mother reads my poem, Cattle Train to Magdeburg. And the best kind of poetry for me is the poetry where you can hear the voice of the person who you're writing about. And for this poem, it's like, it's about 22 lines long. There's one sentence is me, and everything else is my mother. My mother looks at me and says, that's not how it was. I couldn't see anything when they stopped the boxcars and opened the doors. And I didn't see any of those rivers. And if I did, I didn't know their names. No one said, look, that river is the Varta. And that river there, that's the Vistula. What I remember now is the bodies being pushed out. Sometimes women would kick them out with their feet. Now it sounds terrible. You think we were bad women, but we weren't. We were girls taken, excuse me, I'm too close. We were girls taken from homes alone. Some had seen terrible things done to their families. Even though you're a grown man and a teacher, we saw things I can't tell you about. And it's my mother. So I said, what can't you tell me? And she says, I can't tell you. And I said, please. And I started asking her questions. I said, please, what happens? What happened? And she finally said, we were kicking babies out. I said, you were kicking babies out? She said, we were all young girls, and some of the girls were carrying babies, and the conditions in the boxcar were so terrible that they couldn't hold their babies, and they lost their babies. They were born stillborn in the boxcar, and then my mother, she wouldn't tell me anymore, and I didn't want to ask anymore. I'm going to read some poems about my dad. My dad was taken in 1950. My dad was in 1950, in 1940, and he was in western Poland, and it was an area that the Germans wanted to colonize, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to get rid of as many of the Poles as they could, so that they could move a new German population into the area. And so my father was picked up very early. He was a farm boy, and he went to the village near his house to buy some rope. And the village was surrounded, and the soldiers went through and picked people up and took them to Germany. My father was taken to Buchenwald concentration camp. When he was liberated, he weighed 70 pounds. And what amazed me, it was amazing when my father told me that. It was amazing to think of my father as 70 pounds, because when I knew my father was a man who loved to eat, and he would always cook these meals on Saturday mornings, these breakfasts on Saturday mornings, and he would take 3 or 4 kielbasas, and he'd cut them up, and he'd take 2 dozen eggs and put them in a gigantic fry pan, and he and I would sit down and we'd eat all of this stuff, and so that when he told me he weighed 70 pounds, it was inconceivable, and I remember asking him, how were you able to live? I mean, why were you 70 pounds? And my father said, they never fed us. And I thought he was joking. And I did research into the conditions in Buchenwald, and the prisoners lived on about 600 calories a day. Yesterday I was in Chicago, and I spoke to about 200 students at a high school. And before my presentation, somebody had given me a biscotti, these biscottis, these Italian cookies, and a cup of coffee. And I was talking to the students about eating 600 calories a day, and I picked up this biscotti, and I looked at it, and it was 170 calories. So I'm saying, look, my dad would have had like 3 of these, and then he would go out and work 16 hours on a farm or in a factory, or sometimes he would send them to Magdeburg to look through the rubble for dead Germans who had been killed in the bombings of Magdeburg. So I said to my dad, what did you eat, Dad? And he loved to talk about what he ate and what kept him alive in Buchenwald all those years. Because 1 out of 4 people died every year in Buchenwald. And they died of starvation, they died of cruelty. What my father ate. My father ate what he couldn't eat, what even his mother taught him not to. Brown grass, small chips of wood, the dirt beneath his gray, dark fingernails. My father ate the leaves off trees. He ate bark. He ate the flies that tormented the mules working in the fields. He ate what would kill a man in the normal course of his life. Leather buttons, cloth caps, anything small enough to get into his mouth. He ate roots. He ate newspaper. In his slow, clumsy hunger, my father did what the birds did, picked for oats or corn or any kind of seed left in the dry shit by the cows. And when there was nothing to eat, he'd search the ground for pebbles, and they would loosen his saliva, and he would swallow that. And all the other men did the same. My father, he called the guys that he worked with, the guys he worked with, the guys in the camp with him, he always referred to them as his brothers. It's another, I wrote a whole series. I mean, my father couldn't stop talking about his hunger and the things he ate. And so I've written a whole series of these poems. I'll just read you one more. It's called What a Starving Man Has. He has his skin. He has a thinness to his eyes no bread will ever redeem. He has no belly, and his long muscles stand out in relief as if they had been flayed. He's a bony mule with the hard eyes one sees in nightmares or in hell. And he dreams of cabbage and potatoes the way a boy dreams of women's breasts. They come uncalled for, round and fevered like rain that will not stop. There is always the empty sea in his belly, rising, falling, and seeking land. And next to him, there's always another starving man who says, "Help me, brother, I am dying here." My father was there for 4.5 years in Buchenwald, and it's hard to imagine. I don't know if you've seen photographs of Buchenwald. There's an American journalist, Margaret Burke White, who took a series of photographs of right after the liberation, and there are photographs of the barracks, and the barracks, people were sleeping on shelves, and there would be a line of a shelf of guys sleeping on the ground, and then there'd be 14 inches above them there'd be another shelf, and there'd be all of these people sleeping on that shelf, and another shelf, and another shelf, and another shelf, and another shelf, and there'd be like 400 people in a room half the size of this room here. You'd just be sleeping on these shelves. And I tried to imagine what it was like to live in those sorts of conditions. And I wrote a poem about it called Among Sleeping Strangers. The moon set early and it grew darker. And the men settled to sleep in the cold without blankets. Soon it would be spring, but it was still cold. It was always cold at night. And they did what men always did at night when they were cold. They pressed their bodies together and looked for warmth the way a man who has nothing will look, expecting nothing and thankful to God for the little he finds. And the night was long as it always was, and some men crawled roughly across the others to reach an outside wall to relieve themselves. And some men started coughing, and the coughing entered the dreams of some of the other men. and they remembered the agony of their mothers and grandfathers dying of hunger or cholera, their lungs coughed up in blood-streaked phlegm, and some men dreamt down deeper and deeper against the cold till they came somehow to that holy moment in the past when they were warm and full and loved. And the sun in those dreams rose early and set late, and the days were full of church bells and the early spring flowers that stirred their lives. And in the morning, the men shook away from the cold bodies of their brothers and remembered everything they had lost: their wives and children, their lovers, their homes, their frozen fingers, their fathers, the soil they had been born on, the souls they had been born with, and then they crawled up out of the earth and gathered together to work in the dawn. Poem about my mom called Sisters in the Labor Camp. They ate what the Germans gave them: soup that was always too thin, meat alive and gray with maggots, bread made from sawdust and sorrow. And they looked at each other with the same cold eyes and feared that nothing, not even love, would keep them alive till spring. I asked both my parents what it was that they missed most in the labor camps, in the concentration camps. And they both pretty much said the same thing. They said they both missed the human touch. They both missed being touched by somebody who was not hurting them or threatening them. Let's see. Another poem about my mom. It's called The Beets. She arrived in Germany in November of 42, and they were taken out to a farm right away. And she and these other girls on this truck, and they were sent into the field to bring in a beet harvest. And the girls were wearing what they had been wearing when they were captured. So some of them had coats, and some of them had hats, and some of them didn't have coats or hats, and some had shoes, and some didn't have shoes. And they were sent out into the fields. And I said to my mother, "Did they tell you how to dig up the beets?" And my mother said they didn't even give us shovels. And the girls, that first day, they were just working out there digging in the dirt with their hands. And the snow, it was cold and the snow was falling. I think some of my mother's strongest and longest remaining memories were of that first winter when she dug up the beets. She often said that she didn't think she would live till spring. The beets. My mother tells me about the beets she dug up in Germany. They were endless, redder than roses gone bad in an early frost, redder than a grown man's kidney or heart. The first beet she remembers, she was alone in the field, alone without her father or mother near, no sister even. They were all dead, left behind in Poland. The ground was wet and cold, but not soft. It was never soft. My mother ate the raw beet, even though she knew they would beat her. She says sometimes she pretended she was deaf, stupid, crippled, or diseased with typhus or cholera, even with what the children called the French disease, anything to avoid the German slap, the whip across her back, the leather fist in her face above her eye. If my mother could have given them her breasts to suck, her womb to penetrate, she would have, just so they would not hurt her the way they hurt her sister and her mother and the baby. My mother wonders, what was her reward for living in such a world? It was not love or money. She wonders if God will remember her labors. She wonders if there is a God. My mother she just lost all faith in everything because of her experiences in the war. I remember when she was dying, my parents were both raised Catholics, and I remember when my mother was dying, I asked her if she wanted me to have a priest come and give her last sacrament. And my mother said no. She said, I don't want to see a priest. She said, no priest has ever come back from heaven to tell us what's really there. I think I'm going to read a poem just one more poem about my mother, and then I want to read some poems about the very end of the war and how my parents met, and then some poems about coming to America. I really lose track of time when I do this. How's the time look, Todd? Quarter two? Okay, so it's about 30 minutes so far? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read a poem called What the War Taught Her. And then I'll read some poems about the liberation. My mother learned that sex is bad. Men are worthless. It is always cold and there is never enough to eat. She learned that if you are stupid with your hands, you will not survive the winter, even if you survive the fall. She learned only the young survive the camps. The old people are left in piles like worthless paper, and babies are scarce like chickens and bread. She learned that the world is a broken place where no birds sing, and even angels cannot bear the sorrows that God gives them. She learned that you don't pray your enemies will not torment you. You only pray that they will not kill you. My parents met in March of 1945, just before the liberation, just before the end of the war. And my father was on a death march from Buchenwald. What the Germans were trying to do was trying to get people out of Buchenwald, because they were afraid that if the Allies found out about the kinds of things that were going on in the concentration camp, that they would be in more trouble than they were. And so they were trying to empty the camp out. And, they were killing people who seemed to be easy to kill, and people who seemed to still be strong. They sent them on these death marches to march into Germany and keep marching until they died. And my father was in a group of prisoners who were marching past this labor camp my mother was in, and that's how the two of them met. I asked both my parents about this, how they met, and my father's answer was very, very simple and very direct. He said, first we found some bread to eat, and then we got married. And my mother's answer was somewhat longer and more complicated, I guess. And this is another one of those poems that's pretty much in my mother's voice. It's my mother's words. My mother tells me how she met my father. I first saw him in front of the barracks. He was walking with some other prisoners, a German soldier behind them, pushing at them with some kind of rifle. Your father wasn't how he is now. He was skinny then, like two shoelaces tied together. I wasn't such a prize after 3 years in the camps either. When the Americans came, they weighed me and found I was less than 100 pounds. And what was I wearing? You want to know what I was wearing? Woolens on my legs, a gray rag to hide my hair, a striped dress. In him, your father? Like I said, skinny with a bleeding towel across his face from where he lost his eye. Still, he walked up to me, took my hand and said in Polish, "Proszę pani." Yes, he said, "Please, miss." And like a proper gentleman, he clicked his heels. I thought he was at least a count, maybe a prince. Then, just before your father had a chance to kiss my hand, the German behind him kicked him in the pants and said, "Dummkopf, raus! Get moving, dummy." Your father was always like that, always putting on airs, even then in the camps, talking about Polish honor as if he and Poland shared a single soul. Really, he was worthless. I wish he had left me there in the camps. He couldn't drive a car. He couldn't fix a leaky roof. When I asked him in the refugee camp to help me pack to come to America, he took a little drink, bundled all of our clothes together in a bedspread, like America was across the street. The fool. I should have kicked him like the German soldier did when I met him. Instead, I kissed him and wept. We spent 6 years in a refugee camp in Germany, various camps. You know, people say to me, which camp were you in? I think we were in about 142 of the camps. What the United Nations was trying to do is consolidate the camps. They were trying to get people back to where they came from. They wanted to close the camps. They wanted to get Germany back to some kind of sense of stability. And they wanted to get all of these refugees, all these DPs like us out of the country. But it took them 6 years to get rid of us. We came in 1951. One of the first poems I wrote about my parents was a poem about the day we arrived at Ellis Island on the SS General Taylor, an American troop ship. Because what happened was that I was only 3 years old, and we arrived at Ellis Island, and they gave us our trunk, this wooden trunk that my father had made back in Poland, that we brought our stuff in. And I remember looking around, and my father was gone. So I wrote this poem about my father being gone. And I was very, very worried that we had left him on the ship, or they were taking him back to Poland or something. And I never did find out where my father was. And then about a year ago, I started thinking about that, and I wrote a poem called My Father's First Day in America. And it's a poem about what my dad was doing that first day in America when I thought he was going to be with us, standing by this trunk waiting to get on the train to go to Buffalo where we were going. So I'm going to read the poem, My Father's First Day in America. Oh, I should say, my father only had one eye. He only had one eye because he complained about the food in the camp, and the guard took a schlock, a club, and hit him across the face, hit him across the head with this club, and my father got up and he said, you can hit me, but this food is still no good, You ought to be giving us some food that'll keep us alive. And the guard took the club and hit him again with the club, and my father got up again and said, you can hit me as often as you want, this food is still, we can't live on this food. And the guard clubbed him a third time, and when my father woke up, he was blind in one eye, and was never able to see in that eye. So, that's referenced in the poem, My Father's First Day in America. It was as if the world poured itself into his one good eye. He saw sidewalks, steel buildings, a single airplane in the sky, a little girl eating a piece of bread with jam, another little girl drinking something red out of a bottle, a priest looking at his watch before crossing a street, a sheet of newspaper blowing sideways, two drunks dancing a heavy-footed leaping dance, so many cars, not even an educated man who could count so many. Men in suits with suitcases so small a child could carry 4 or 5 of them, even to Moscow, even to Magdeburg. Women in dresses so light, the slightest wind would reveal every bone and the curving flesh around it. Their beauty so pure, he felt his hands open and his palms turned to them. And my father asked the blessed world before him in a Polish it would never understand. Why did they do it? Why did the Germans drag us off, kill us, and keep us chained for so long? We came in 1951, and we had to spend a year working for this farmer outside of, an Italian-American farmer outside of Buffalo, who paid for our passage over. And I've written a series of poems about that. They're called the Promised Land poems. I'll read you a couple of them about when we first came. The first one is called Coming to America, 1951. And kids ask questions, and I asked my mother, what did we have when we came? And so this is a poem about what we had when we came to America. I mean, all we had was a trunk, about this big. So I asked her, what did we have in that trunk? When I ask my mother now what we had when we came from the camps in Germany, she shrugs and starts the list. Some plates, a wooden cross, some barley bread, a crucifix, 4 goose-down pillows and a frying pan, a letter from a friend in America. We were poor as mud, she says, and we prayed for so little. To find her sister, to work, to not think about the dead, to live without anger or fear. I was 3 years old when we came, and we all had to work. You know, my sister was 5, she had to work on this farm. I was 3, I had to work. My parents, of course, had to work. And I have no memory of this stuff. I was 3 years old. And I asked my mother, I said, well, what was it like when we got there to this Italian-American farmers? And she said, well, let me tell you about the first November. And so I wrote a poem called The Farms of Buffalo, New York. In the orchards that first fall, my parents picked apples, red ones, sweet as white sugar. And my sister and I waited near the ladders to catch the apples before they touched the ground. But our hands were small, the apples big and hard. They came so fast, like stones thrown by bad boys. We begged our mother to please let us go back to the refugee camps in Germany. We'd be good. I mean, it's true. She said, you begged us to go back to Germany. We begged our mother to please let us go back to the refugee camps in Germany. We'd be good. We'd be careful when we picked the strawberries in the spring. We wouldn't stop till we were done. And we promised we'd never cry if she'd just let us back. But her heart was stripped to bone. And she told us if we didn't work, we would die in Buffalo. No. One more of these poems. Winter in America. My mother remembered the German cold. Winters that broke the souls of old people and left children frozen like wheat stalks in the fields. Hollow reeds the wind and ice blew through. In Buffalo, there was cold too. Picking apples in late October, she felt it on her hands and feet, remembered the wooden shoes she wore in the labor camps, how cold the frozen wood was on her skin as she dug for beets in Germany. My mother knew nothing about America, but thought that maybe farther west there wouldn't be so much snow. And that's what we did. We went to Chicago. My parents did that one year outside of Buffalo and wanted nothing more to do with farms and wanted to live in a city. My father had been a farm boy and spent years in Germany in the camps doing farm work, and he said it was just too hard to do. He wanted to go someplace where the work was easier in a factory. Let's see. Yeah, how about one or two more poems? Yeah. just one more poem about my dad. It's called Looking for Work in America. I think about my dad and what kind of resume he had. We think about getting jobs now, and we're all working on resumes, or they're thinking about our resumes and our CVs and stuff like that. And I thought about my father and what his resume would have looked like. It's a poem called Looking for Work in America. My father knew death the way a blind man knows his mother's voice. He had walked through villages in Poland and Germany where only the old were left to search for oats in the fields or beg the soldiers for a cup of milk. My father knew the dead, the way they smelled in their dark, full faces, the clack of their teeth when they were desperate to tell you about their lives. Once my father watched a woman in the moments before she died take a stick and try to write her name in the mud where she lay. He'd buried children too, and he knew he could do any kind of work a man could ask him to do. He knew there was only work or death. He could dig up beets and drag fallen trees without bread or hope. The war taught him how. He came to the States with this and his tools, hands that had worked bricks and frozen mud and knew the language the shit bosses spoke. Yeah. Thank you. Questions? Questions? I gotta loosen my jacket. Yeah.
When was the earliest, your parents told you about their experience?
Oh, the question, her question is, when did I hear about these stories from my parents? It's very interesting. My father started telling me stories about what happened in Germany when I was probably about 5 or 6 years old. I honestly can't remember a time when we didn't hear these stories. He had what would now be said, people would now say that he had no filter, that he didn't have any way of separating what had happened to him, these terrible things that had happened to him, from what he should actually be talking about with children. He couldn't control that. And so he talked about this stuff all the time, and my mother was the complete opposite. She couldn't talk about these things. She wouldn't talk about these things. I would ask her sometimes, as I got older, I would ask her, my father would tell me one thing and I would say to my mother, what was it like? I would ask her for her side of what things were like. And my mother would just, she would just shake her head, say, and wave me away. The only thing she would say for a long time was, she would say, if they give you bread, you have to eat it. If they beat you, you have to run away. I mean, it was like the only thing she would say about her experiences. Never told me about her mother, never told me about what had happened to her sister, never told me what had happened to her. It was only really late in her life, after my father died. My father died in 1997, and it was only after my father died that she started talking about these things. And I think that part of the reason why she didn't want to talk to me is that she was a mother and she wanted to protect me from these stories. And so she didn't tell me these stories. And I think that at some point she thought that I was old enough to, in my 50s, she thought I was old enough to hear these stories. And even then, like I read the poem about my mother reads my poem, Cattle Train in Magdeburg. Even then, there were still things she wouldn't tell me, that she couldn't tell me. That one of the last conversations we had was about something that she really wanted to tell me. And this was just before, maybe a month, 2 months before she died, and it was something that she really wanted to tell me about something that had happened toward the end of the war. And she started, and then she said, I don't remember what happened. And that's all she said, I don't remember what happened. And there was something that wanted to come out, and it wouldn't come out. Or she pushed it back in. Sure, Andy.
At which point did you decide, and was it a point at which you decided to put this all in writing, to begin?
No, you know, he asked at what point I decided to start writing about this stuff. There was no decision. What, you know, I wanted to get, I felt hobbled by my parents' past. I felt hobbled being Polish American, living in a Polish American community. I felt there were so many things I couldn't do because I was Polish. I never went to a ball. We lived right around from. I mean, I was a kid. Okay, we lived right across. We lived not too far from Wrigley Field. I never went to a ball game. No kid on my street, and it was a street of you know, kids who were born in the refugee camps. No kid on my street ever went to a ball game. You know, and all of that stuff. You know, I wanted to push that stuff away, and I did for a long, long time. And then I was working on my doctorate, my PhD in English, and I was finishing up my PhD. I was working on American literature. And I sat down when I was working in this office, and I wrote the first poem about my parents. And it was a hot August day, and I started thinking about what my parents were thinking about. You know, it's just one of those sort of crazy thoughts that comes into your head. And what I realized was that they were probably thinking about these things that had happened in Poland and in Germany. And I wrote a poem about what they must be thinking of. You know, the poem is something about how, you know, they are living unhurried lives of unhurried memories. And then I go through the memories, and some of the memories that appear in the poem are some of the first memories I heard from my father. One of the first things I remember my father talking about was seeing a German soldier cut off a woman's breasts. And, you know, I was a kid, and that image stayed with my father. My father was always talking about seeing that act of brutality and cruelty, and it couldn't leave him, and obviously it couldn't leave me either, because you know, 10 years after moving away from home and, you know, studying all of this American literature and doing all of this, you know, suddenly this image that my father passed down to me appears in this thing I'm writing. I wrote one poem. I never thought I'd write another poem about my parents, and then the next year I wrote another one. And then, you know, another one a couple of years later, and then more and more and more. My first book came out in '99, and it was, I think it was like 28 poems about them. And I thought, well, I'm done with this. In fact, one of my friends said to me, "Boy, I hope you're all Holocausted out with that stuff. I hope, you know, you move on to something else." He said, "John, you got a great sense of humor. You're wasting your writing talent on writing this kind of depressing stuff. Write something funny." And then, you know, my dad died just before that book came out, and then my mother started telling me these stories, and so I was hearing more stories and getting more stories and writing more and more and more. And with my mother, it became really interesting because she wanted to talk about this stuff, and she saw herself as having a responsibility. You know, I told her one time I was going to be doing a presentation like this, and you know what she said? She said, "Tell them that your father and I were not the only two people in the slave labor camps." And I said, "Yeah, okay, Mom." She thought I was going to create this sort of false impression in people's minds that there were these two Poles, these two, you know, isolated solo Poles in Germany doing this work. She wanted me to tell people there were a lot of Poles in these camps. Yeah, what, 3 million Poles were taken to the slave labor camps? Yeah. And she wanted people to know, and I think she felt some kind of responsibility. I think especially after Miłosz, there was that quote from Miłosz. After Miłosz said, "Yeah, this guy's doing a good job," my mother thought, well, you know, maybe there's some point in me telling him some stories. And so she started telling me stories. And I would go visit her, and she would say, "Take out, you know, get that legal pad. I want you to write this down." And she would start telling me stories. And that, you know, it was like that. It was like that for about 8 years, and then it wasn't. You know, she just got to a point where I think she had told me all the stories that she could tell me, and then there were the stories that she couldn't tell me. And that's when she stopped telling me stories, all of the stories that she couldn't tell me. She, you don't know, you listen to people, you don't know what actually happened, what happened. I said to her one time, she said to me, she didn't think she was going to survive that first week in November with the beets and the snow coming down and all of that stuff. And I said to her, how did you survive? And she said, a German soldier took pity on her and came up to her and said to her, do you know how to milk a cow? And my mother said, yeah, I'm a farm girl. I know how to milk a cow. And so he took her into a barn and he said, here are some cows. Milk these cows and you can stay in this barn with these cows. And the cows, I don't know if you know anything about cows. Cows they generate a lot of heat. And she says what kept her alive that first winter was being in this barn with these cows and drinking the milk from these cows. And she said sometimes they would beat her for drinking the milk, sometimes they wouldn't. But so she told me this story, and I wonder if that was the entire story, if there was more to that story. Yeah. Yes.
So, when did you begin writing poetry, and what did you write about? Because it sounds like you started writing about your parents' story later in life.
Yeah, I was. I'm trying to think. I was 31 years old when I started writing about it. And
when did you start writing poetry?
oh, when I started writing poetry, I wrote poetry. I started writing poetry in 1966, 67. I was a student at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I was studying American literature. I took 3 poetry classes from some good poets there. And I wrote some poems, but I never felt I had anything to talk about in my poetry. I wrote a poem about walking down Michigan Avenue in Chicago, just sort of poems that for me seemed to lack something. And so after college, I stopped writing poetry, and I devoted myself to writing academic prose. The kinds of things that were expected of me in graduate school. And it wasn't until when I was 31 when I started writing poetry. And then I started writing fiction when I was, how old was I when I started writing fiction? Just when my mother died, I started writing fiction. I wrote a novel about the German soldiers who came to my mother's house and killed my grandmother. And killed my mother's sister and raped my mother. I started thinking about those soldiers and what was going on in their heads. And so I wrote a novel from their point of view. I think it's going to be published in July of this year, called Road of Bones. Yeah.
John,
Yeah.
I want to mention your new book, Suitcase Charlie.
Oh, Suitcase Charlie. Oh, okay. I wrote the Road of Bones also. The Suitcase Charlie. I wrote a novel about my neighborhood growing up in Chicago in the 1950s, in a Polish neighborhood full of survivors and DPs. And it's a novel about a serial killer, and it's loosely based on what happened to 3 boys who were murdered by someone. And it frightened us because these 3 little boys were murdered and were abused and then murdered and then thrown into a park in Chicago. And I lived right next to a park, Humboldt Park, and my friends lived right next to this. We all lived right next to this park. And so what we had stuck in our heads was this thought that there was someone in the park killing people, killing children, and the novel it works out of that fear, and for a while when I was a kid, it was thought that the murders were acts of anti-Semitism. These 3 boys were Jewish boys who were murdered, and so they thought that it was an anti-Semitic crime, and so my novel ties that crime to what's going on in this neighborhood. And it's about somebody trying to, yeah, I don't want to give you any more. I don't want to say any more. It's called Suitcase Charlie. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Andy?
You touched on it a couple of times, including a few moments ago, about growing up in a Polish community. And what I was going to ask is well, two questions really, and they're sort of related. One is whether your parents and your family grew up within in a circle of people whose experiences were much like theirs.
Oh, absolutely.
Much in common.
Yeah,
And sort of related to that, and I'm thinking in terms of what we know today about post-traumatic stress and all, everything that comes with that, a term that probably wasn't known as far as I know back then, although the conditions were probably known. Does any of that resonate? I mean, can you relate that to your parents' experience, your family?
My block, my parents owned an apartment house on this block, just outside, just on the border of Humboldt Park, and there were 6 families living in this apartment building. There were two Jewish widows living in the back who had both been in concentration camps in Poland. On the 3rd floor in the back was a fellow who was a Russian POW and had been in the concentration camps in Germany. There were my parents. On the floor right above us, there was another family that had also come over as DPs. This was in one 6-unit apartment building in the middle of the block. The people on the right-hand side of our house is a family, mother and father, and they were also DPs. 2 doors away was this fellow, Mr. Fish, a Jewish fellow who had survived in Poland also. The whole block, I'm sure there were people who weren't from the camps or who weren't DPs on this block, but there were so many people. And post-traumatic stress disorder. The big middle of this book is about the refugee experience, our coming to America, and for me, a lot of those memories are about the crazy things that I saw in the neighborhood happening to kids I knew, and these kids were DPs. The kids had been born in the camps like me, in the refugee camps. Their parents had been slave laborers in the concentration camps, and survivors of one kind or another. And these kids were having strange experiences, traumatic experiences. I had a friend, his name was Joe. His father would get angry with him, and his father would strip him naked and beat him with a belt. And you would see Joe being chased down the street by his father. And this is when Joe was like, 10, 12, 13 years old. There were 2 little girls who lived 2 doors away in the same house. Mr. Fish, he lived in the basement of Mr. Fish's house. And Patty and Kathy, and I knew them from the time they were about 6 and 7 years old to the time when they were about 13 or 14. Their father had been in Buchenwald also. And he would come home from work, and he could not sleep in the house if there were people in the house with him. So he would send his 2 daughters and their mother out of the house until he had fallen asleep, and then they could come back into the house. And they would stand on a street corner, sometimes for hours, just waiting for him to fall asleep. And then they would, and this, I remember them being kids, 5 and 6 years old, standing on a street corner. I remember them as teenagers standing on a street corner, waiting for their father to go to sleep. I've got my mother, I had a sister, Donna. I haven't read any poems about Donna, but they had a terrible relationship. My mother would beat my sister, and in very brutal ways. And my sister, when my mother was dying, we had never talked about it. My sister and I hadn't talked about this brutality. My mother would chase my sister through the house with a broom, My sister would hide under a bed, try to get away from my mother. My mother would jab the broom at my sister. And we never talked about this stuff. And my mother was dying, and my sister said, my sister said, I will never forgive you. I will never forgive father, and I will never forgive mother. I won't forgive her because she did those things to me, but I won't forgive you. She wouldn't forgive me or my father. She said, you never stopped her from doing those things. And I said, I said I was a kid. I was younger than you. And now when I think back on it, I mean, I was living in a neighborhood where there was so much of this stuff going on. My friend Stash, his mother got angry with him. His mother had been in labor camp. She got angry with him and she hit him in the face with a coffee pot and broke his teeth. We're just seeing this stuff all the time. And I thought, well, this is the way stuff goes on. But my sister said she will never forgive us. And she said at that same time, she said, I think mother is crazy. And I think she's always been crazy, because only a crazy person would do these things. I gave a reading in Chicago in one of the western suburbs called Darien, and my sister lives in Darien. My sister has never heard me read. She's never read anything. She doesn't want to know anything about this stuff. She came to the reading, and and one of the things, we talked about afterward. I think she's beginning to forgive my mother. She talked about the things she learned from my mother, and the fact that she came to the reading really surprised me. I wasn't expecting her to come, and she brought one of her daughters with her. But I think that 10 years after my mother's death, I think she's beginning to forgive my mother. And I talked to my mother about, the things my sister had said. Before my mother died, I talked to her about this stuff. And my mother didn't understand what my sister was talking about. She said, I don't understand. I didn't. She said she didn't understand. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you do these presentations in other cities?
I do these presentations.
Like in other states? Or?
Yeah, I'm living in Virginia. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm living in Virginia now, and I've been doing presentations about my parents on a regular basis. Probably I retired 10 years ago, and so I've been doing them for 10 years. I've done them all over the East Coast. In all kinds of situations. I talk to high school students. I've spoken in synagogues. Sunday I spoke in a Unitarian church. Spoken in Episcopal. Lots of churches. Church groups want to hear about these sorts of stories. I've spoken to a lot of Polish groups.
What did you retire from? What did you retire from?
Oh, I was a professor. I should have done this, and we should have both done this in my introduction. I was a college professor. I taught American literature and creative writing in Eastern Illinois University in Charleston. Yes, I've been doing this for about 10 years and talking about my parents. I do about 20 presentations, and always enjoy it. Talking to all kinds of groups, Polish groups, non-Polish groups. Honestly, it's the kind of history that people just don't hear. About there are things that everybody seems to know about World War II, and there are things that nobody knows about World War II. And I think one of the things that nobody knows about World War II is the refugee situation, the displaced persons camps, all of that stuff. And when I tell people that there were 15 million displaced persons in Germany, refugees, 15 million refugees, it's mind-boggling. It's just a crazy sort of fact.
That's just the refugees. That doesn't include the millions of people that, the families of those people that were affected.
Oh, yeah.
even to this day.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, the numbers are just phenomenal numbers. You know, one of the things I like to mention is that there were 50 million civilian deaths in World War II. I mean, incomprehensible numbers. 50 million civilian deaths. And that's a sort of average estimate. I've seen higher, I've seen lower, but that's a sort of average estimate. And, you know, just, I was doing a presentation like this last week someplace, and somebody said to me, how can you explain that kind of terror, that kind of brutality and that kind of craziness? And I said, I just don't know how to explain that much suffering being inflicted on just so many people.
Is there any other country that caused so much horror in history?
Well, you know, that horror.
The German army? I mean,
Well-
the Romans or...
Oh, I don't know. You know, I was doing a presentation at Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia, and it was interesting afterward. You know, I was talking about this sort of stuff, and I mentioned the 50 million civilians, and then a young man came up to me with a British accent, and he said he was his grandparents rather, had been in slave labor camps in Malaysia. And I said, slave labor camps in Malaysia. And they were camps set up by the Japanese. There were 3 million civilian deaths in Malaysia during the Second World War. You know, who knew? You know, just all of this horror. When I used to teach, I taught a course called War Stories, and we looked at memoirs about the Second World War. And I remember one of the things we said about the 20th century was that it was the century of cemeteries and graveyards because of all of these sort of senseless civilian deaths. Yes, sir.
Regarding this question,
Yeah.
2013 I went to the Holocaust Museum,
Yeah.
and there was an extra survivor that we were able to talk to and ask questions. And there was a similar question, and according to what she said, in Poland, it was also Nazis, but also the Russians were really, really bad.
Yeah.
From what she
Yeah.
explained, Russians were pretty bad too.
Yeah. Do you want to tell your story?
John, just as a reference, you might want to look at Tim Snyder's book, Bloodland.
No, yeah.
It deals with Poland, Belarus, and Lithuania.
Yeah. It's a
He
tremendous
talks
book.
about the implications of the Nazi-Soviet pact, and he argues essentially between 1934 and 1948, 14 million people died who were not soldiers,
Yeah.
who didn't die of disease or natural causes. 14 million people died as a result of the actions of Hitler and Stalin in this one place. I just might want to add, though, how do you explain this? Joseph Stalin, who, above all people, knew about these things, once said to Churchill, the death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Unless you can see
yeah,
the individual tragedies, the kind of thing you're talking
Absolutely. I wrote an essay, a sort of memoir essay about my parents and about war and this sort of thing, and it's called Numbers in War. And all I do in the essay is go through the numbers and how war is associated with numbers to the point where the numbers are completely meaningless. Wars have numbers associated with them that finally don't mean anything, that we can't feel those numbers. When my mother said to me, tell them we weren't the only ones in the camps, what she wanted me to tell people was that, forget those numbers. There were individuals, people in these camps who had lives, who suffered terribly. A lot of the stories that I heard from my parents were not only about their suffering, my father talking about what he ate, but they were the stories about the people they knew in the camps and the things that happened to them. And when my father was dying, my father died, he was 77 years old, and he was dying of pancreatic cancer. He was filled up with morphine because he was in so much pain, and he was convinced that, you know, the nurses and the doctors were Nazis, and they had to rope him down, and occasionally they had to strap him into the bed, but occasionally he would become lucid. You know, he'd get out of that morphine fog, and he would tell me stories about the people he knew in the camps. And one of the last stories he told me was about a story. It was a story he had never told me about a friend of his named Yashu, who was from Vilno, and he was an artist, and he was beaten and castrated and hanged by the Germans. And my father, dying of pancreatic cancer, wants to get one more story about a life ending terribly. He wanted to get one more story out before he succumbed to the morphine and succumbed to death. There are just so many of these stories, just endless stories, so many stories. And when I hear that people, you know, won't tell the stories, or people don't want to listen to stories, or it pains me. My wife's dad was in D-Day, and he never talks about the war. Never talks about marching across Germany. You know, none of that stuff. Doesn't talk about any of that stuff. One Christmas, we were having dinner, and the whole family, there were like 20 people, a big table and all of this, and he started telling a story about Christmas in the war. And it was like no one wanted to hear this story, that it was somehow interfering. And he never told me, he just never talks about this stuff, but he wanted to tell this story. And then he stopped telling the story because he felt that he was interfering with everybody's holiday. And everyone felt uncomfortable when he started telling the story, because he's an older man. He was becoming very emotional. There were tears in his eyes, tears in his voice as he was telling the story. And it was just making everybody so uncomfortable that it was like everybody just wanted him to stop, and he stopped. And, you know, it broke my heart. It broke my heart. Because, you know, you have to listen to those stories. You have to pursue those stories. My mother didn't want to tell the stories. I had to pursue those stories. And I felt better hearing the stories. She felt better telling the stories. You have, you know, so talk to people. Get those stories. Get stories. You know, keep them alive. Keep them in the family. Pass them on to people. Other questions? Is that for me?
Well, there are some refreshments.
Oh yeah,
John will be happy to sign.
Happy to sign. You know, I was about 15 minutes ago when I finished reading the poetry. I was going to tell everybody to go and get a snack and sit down, and I forgot. I wish somebody would have reminded me. I did a presentation like this someplace, and it was so late by the time I ended up talking that they had taken the food away and nobody got anything. In fact, one place, they took the wine away. You got any wine over there? One of the places I went to, they had wine, and by the time I ended up talking. Pardon?
They were drinking it.
This was Columbia University. All of the students took the wine by the time I got done. Yeah, please come over here. Thank you. Thank you.